I'm Susanna Cluff-Clyburne, Senior Director of Parliamentary Affairs with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. With me is Lianne Ing, and Lianne is the Vice President of Bubble Technologies and based in Chalk River, Ontario. Lianne sits on the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's Board of Directors and also is a member of our SME Committee. Lianne, thank you very much for spending some time with me today. We're speaking with some of our SME members, as I mentioned to you earlier, to get a sense of how the COVID-19 crisis is affecting them or could affect them in the future. While we hear about the impact of the pandemic at a very high, broad level, it's really important, we feel, for our members and those that belong to the Canadian Business Resilience Network to hear the stories from individual small and medium business people. But before we get started, I wondered if you could just tell me a little bit about Bubble Technologies.
Sure, thanks, Susanna. So Bubble Technology Industries, as you mentioned, is based in Chalk River, Ontario. We're a 50-person business. We specialize in developing radiation and explosives detection technologies that are used in defense, homeland security, and space applications. So a little bit of an unusual niche market. We do most of our business internationally, and so we do a lot of exporting. When we see a crisis like COVID-19, there are certainly impacts across our supply chain.
Has COVID-19 had an impact on Bubble Technologies?
Yes. I don't know if you'd be hard-pressed probably at this point to find a company that hasn't been affected by it. Right now, the impacts have been primarily on work environment for us. So we are designated an essential business under the province of Ontario's emergency orders, which means we're permitted to stay open. But in accordance with public health guidelines, we've moved about 80% of our staff to remote work back in March, and we've been working in that arrangement since then. So that in and of itself, that transition required a very intense and rapid transition to prepare to move everyone to offsite work. There was a flurry of activity in terms of getting the required IT tools in place, identifying equipment and resources that people were going to need to work remotely. And for the handful of people that were staying on site to continue essential operations, we needed to make sure that we could follow all of the physical distancing guidelines. So that has definitely been a significant adjustment for us. We have certainly experienced in that process the impact of not having very good high-speed internet. We're in a rural area. When you move all of your staff or 80% of your staff off-site, all of a sudden that bandwidth limitation becomes incredibly apparent. And so we've had to be very creative and flexible, trying to find ways of keeping everybody working despite the inefficiency that comes with some of those difficulties with internet speed.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, you have quite a few government clients at Bubble Technologies. What are you hearing anything from them about the impact of the pandemic on them and their ability maybe to do business in the future with you?
Yes, I mean, so we do a lot of work, as I said, internationally. That includes a lot of customers with the U.S. government as well as Europe and Asia. I think across the board, there's concern about what things are going to look like longer term. So we've been fortunate in the short term in that the pandemic struck when we had a fairly significant order backlog. We had contracts in hand. Our sales cycles tend to be quite long, so 12 to 18-month sales cycles are not unusual. So in the short term, we have not had a severe financial impact, but what we're hearing is concern amongst customers regarding whether they're going to see any kind of available budget, a year from now. And so for a company like ours in our industry with these very long sales cycles, we might really see the financial impact, a year or two out from now when people have been unable to start new programs or start new procurements.
So there have been a lot of support programs that have come out at rapid fire pace in the last 2.5 months. Has Bubble Technologies taken advantage of any of those programs?
So in our circumstance, we have had pretty limited eligibility so far. We were able to access the original 10% business wage subsidy that the federal government permitted, but you'll remember that that had a maximum value of $25,000.
Yes.
That was not really that significant. We've had a couple of staff members who have requested leave because of either personal circumstances in terms of health or a requirement to care for family members. They have applied for and accessed the CERB fund.
Right.
But at the federal level, that's been about it. So far, we have not really been taking advantage or been eligible for a lot of the federal support programs.
Having been deemed an essential service and your business as usual as much as you possibly can be.
Right. Yeah.
What's your sense of how the government's been dealing with the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of those things which is a curveball for everyone. So it's been a lot of trying to come up with policy very quickly and rolling out programs that, while they may not be perfect, are meant to be there as a safety net. I think there's a couple of things that we're concerned about looking ahead. One is really just making sure that the government is thinking about how to prepare for a potential second wave. We're still in the situation where we are remote working, and that remote work, if there's a second wave, could extend for months longer. And in that scenario, this ongoing issue of internet bandwidth becomes, really a negative impact on our efficiency and our ability to do work. So our hope is that the government will be looking at near-term infrastructure investments that they can make that would make this sort of scenario more sustainable, allowing businesses to still function over the long term.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I think this general concern, this is true with all of our business partners and suppliers from around the world. I think everybody's concerned, long term, how our government's going to deal with the debt burden that's coming from the current scenario. How are they going to try to address potentially longer term effects, on companies and industries like ours, where we may not see the real impact for, a year to 2 years from now. And those are all tough questions. And what it leads to is a lot of uncertainty and trepidation with a lot of people in industry, which inevitably means, people will tend to invest less and just be a little bit safer. And that's always a detriment when you're in an industry where you're really trying to push the envelope in terms of technology development. So, a great deal of uncertainty and concern about how we pay the bills long term.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of a nice segue into what I wanted to ask you finally, and that is what should the government and business be thinking about? We're starting to see reopening. What should we be thinking about as we move from reopening and into recovery?
Mm-hmm. I know from our perspective within our company, we're certainly looking at this as a learning opportunity. As a small business with 50 people working in research, we are accustomed to operating in a very dynamic situation. So I think we were well prepared from a company culture perspective to adapt as needed to adjust to the circumstances. From this experience, we've implemented new online collaborative platforms and new tools that allow for remote work. And we'll be looking for the positive aspects of those tools to retain in terms of the type of work that we do and how we execute that work. Like I said, I think preparation for subsequent waves of either this pandemic or other similar issues, we're definitely looking at trying to have taking the lessons learned from this activity and developing good future pandemic policies and planning scenarios for ourselves. I think the government, like I said, needs to really look at where some of the pitfalls have been in the response. I think we've seen that rapid response is a good way of trying to flatten the curve. What are the indicators that they could act on more quickly, and what are some of the infrastructure investments that they could make that will make something like this a little easier to survive in the future?
The next time, because something will hit us again. It's just a question of if it's natural or a pandemic or a massive cyber attack or something. But it's good to be prepared. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Lianne, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know that even though you're working from home, things are probably still pretty busy work-wise, and your perspectives are always very valuable, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.